Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. There's one building in particular that I saw when I first emerged from the subway into Toronto, and I have to ask about its architectural significance because I hear it's had a lot of social significance. What is the architectural meaning in Toronto of Honest Ed's?
Honest Ed's. That's an interesting one. The building was a discount retailer, much like the ones that you used to see in the big cities across North America. But what's interesting about it is that the owner, who was Honest Ed Mirvish, never really did the things that other retailers did. He never really modernized the place. So in a lot of ways, it is today, what it was 50 years ago, which is a place for Torontonians of all stripes, and especially, middle class and working class people who, really value a bargain, and like cheesy puns to come. The store has, these various kind of folksy traditions, like giving out turkeys on Christmas, and generally it's just sort of a very folksy sort of bargain retailer of the kind that no longer really exists. And
soon won't exist at all.
Exactly, and it will soon disappear. And that is Toronto in 2014 for you.
I see. Here in Toronto in 2014, we are on Notebook on Cities and Culture, where it's a neighborhood I walked past Honest Ed to get to, the Christie Pits neighborhood. So I hear it's called. I was informed of that by my guest today, Alex Bozikovic. He is the architecture columnist for the Globe and Mail, and his writing on architecture and design has appeared in various publications, including Dwell, Architectural Digest, Toronto Life, Spacing, and many others. Are you called? I feel like I've read you write about Honest Ed's. Are you called upon to write about this place much?
I just was called to write about it, or more specifically about the redevelopment proposal that's coming for the site right now, and which has become a real talking point for this part of the city and for the city at large, because it is sort of this. It's going to see what was a landmark of the city disappear and be replaced by a kind of urbanism that I think really represents where the city is going.
What is that kind of urbanism? Where is the city going?
Well, we've seen in the central part of Toronto, in and around downtown, there's been a boom for the last almost 20 years now of construction of new, mostly high-rise housing. These are mostly condos that people are buying to own and to live in, or in other cases to rent. But there are new buildings, quite large, anywhere from 100 to 300 or 400 units, and a lot of them are high-rise, which is really challenging to some people's idea of what this city should be. There's a sort of a broad conception of the city, or at least the old part of the city, as a city of single-family houses, on streets like this one, of low houses on nicely treed streets, a lot of green, a lot of quiet, and there's the sense that new dense infill projects are transforming that. And what we're going to be seeing at Honest Ed's is probably a new version of that. That site is, I think, about 4 acres. It's quite large, and it's going to be, I think, mixed use with a lot of restaurants and retail, maybe a little bit of office space and housing of different kinds in a very, what I think is going to be a very sort of complex and nuanced sort of arrangement, which will make for an interesting piece of city. And I'm actually looking forward to projects of that kind, new developments that are mixed use and are carefully designed and have really good quality urban design. We haven't always seen that here. We've seen a lot of development, but it hasn't always been as sensitive or as sophisticated. And I think that's going to be changing in the near future.
A lot of what you say there, it reminds me, or it adds to this line of thinking I've had this whole time in Toronto this week. I didn't expect there to be so many parallels between Toronto and Los Angeles, where I live. Like you say, this idea that the high-rises go against the traditional idea of Toronto, that it's low-rise, lowish density, although this particular neighborhood it's single-family houses, but it's higher density than a lot of what people call Los Angeles. Right. I mean, there's this sense that there are a few competing ideas of Los Angeles, like there are competing ideas of Toronto. And I mean, the struggle isn't in Los Angeles, seems a bit more generational. Like someone my age, I'm 30 this year, will definitely want to live in the denser Los Angeles that's emerging within the low density Los Angeles. Somebody above 50, 60, has an image of what Los Angeles might have been like in 1962, and on some level they know it's not coming back, but on some level still agitate for it. I mean, is it the same here?
It really is. I've been interested in reading a lot about Los Angeles over the last few years because I think the parallels, not necessarily in terms of the urban form, but in terms of the sort of the city's conception of itself are very good. And in a lot of ways there are close parallels. And it is generational. Here, as in cities across North America, you have, anybody under 30. Not anyone. I should rephrase that. A growing number of people under 30 are interested in living in a denser, more walkable, more interesting kind of city. And in many cases, in Toronto, rather than move to the suburbs, as people have generally done when they have kids, they're choosing to stay. The thing is with Toronto that the picture is actually more complicated than that. Because a high-rise Toronto has existed for a long time. A high-rise Toronto has existed in the suburbs, in fact, for longer than most of us have been here.
And that's a contrast to anywhere in America, high-rise suburbs.
It's a very interesting sort of peculiar thing, but it goes back to Toronto's political and planning history. The city. When we talk about Toronto, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about what was the old city of Toronto, the fairly compact area that was the city up until the early 20th century, and which was mostly built out, by that point. It's dense, it's walkable, it's, inner city and streetcar suburbs. But there's also what used to be the metropolitan Toronto area, which is all part of what is now called the city of Toronto, but has a very different character. It's mostly post-war suburbs. And those were built up, from the 50s through the 70s at a time when Toronto was growing, very robustly, and when there was a lot of, public sector as well as private sector investment in the city, and also a very sort of, robust and thoughtful kind of planning and regulations. So, the city grew. A lot of what is now Toronto, on paper, is modern. Toronto is in many ways a modern city, and we haven't culturally come to terms with the fact that that is true.
It goes along with this seeming sense of Canada, within Canada anyway, that it's something I've talked about a lot just to people here, but I've always thought of Canada as it seems like Canada has more people in it than California, but it doesn't. It has 10 million less. But it feels to me like it has more people because it's a mostly urban population. Yet Canada believes itself to be rural in some sense, that there's like that cognitive dissonance here, right?
It is. I mean, it's a bit of a different thing than America, but in terms of at the city level, it's actually quite similar. Because when you talk about many Canadians living in urban areas, the fact is, I think the number is 70% today. But the fact is that most of those people are really living in suburbs. The post-war suburbs that I told you about, and those that are more recent and further out, that are totally car dependent and totally car focused. So that's where a good chunk of Canadians live today. But that shift has been fairly recent, and for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, we still think of ourselves as, a country in many ways, a country of wilderness, connected to the north, connected to the wild, and even though almost all Canadians live, along a very narrow strip close to the American border, our, national self-conception doesn't really reflect that sort of urban and suburban, southern reality. And that in Toronto, in many ways, is kind of an outlier in Canada. Canadians think of Toronto as being self-centered and arrogant and, somehow kind of un-Canadian because it's so urban and fast-paced and, people live in apartments and take the subway. But, it is, there is that strange tension that, a lot of Canadians live as many people here do in a, kind of a suburban state. And all of these things here, especially because the country is so young and so, has grown so rapidly over the last 40 years. These are contradictions that we're still locally and as a nation still trying to figure out.
Even some of the urbanist types I've talked to here, they will refer to the downtown condos, especially the newer ones, as, just by definition, uninspired buildings like, oh boy, some more condo buildings. I mean, from your perspective as an architectural critic, are these types of buildings really, for the most part, dull?
Yes. There's the people who are designing these new buildings aren't really getting the chance to do creative work, on the level of detail or, on the urban level. The form and the makeup of these projects has followed a pretty consistent formula of, for the most part, stores on the main floor, which the city has required even when developers don't want to do it, which is great in terms of urban design, at least in theory, and then apartments above that. And, these apartments are generally quite small, easily rented rentable, work for singles and couples. And that's been, there's been a real homogeneity to what the development industry here has delivered to the city. And as I was, sort of hinting at before, I think we're going to see, out of necessity, different models developing. And I think that's going to be really interesting. Still,
different models of building or of city construction?
I hope so. I mean, there are a few different proposals for how Toronto could be more dense without having the same number of high-rise buildings. And partly we need to look at that because, a lot of the most obvious places to build really big, tall buildings in Toronto, have now been built out. So now, planners, developers, architects have to look at sort of the trickier sites. And in many cases, those are integrated into what we call in Toronto with a capital N neighborhoods, which are, low-rise buildings, which are, single-family or 2 or 3 family houses, where there's, very strong local senses of community and, and an opposition to any real kind of change. One alternative is what's, the city planning department is pushing as midrises along certain fairly major streets across the city. And I think that model is really interesting. The difficulty is, actually making it happen. Those buildings are trickier from a business point of view to do. But I think, buildings of, 6 or 8 stories could actually be architecturally more interesting, and they're great for the city in many ways. They also hark back to an architectural tradition in Toronto that goes back to the 60s, and one of these sort of formative ideas in the contemporary architectural culture of the city. And that is an attention to infill and an attention to context. When you talk about urbanism or architecture in Toronto, you have to talk about Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you have already.
This is her final resting place. I've thought a lot about it. I'm staying in the annex, so naturally that was her neighborhood, but she's come up surprisingly rarely in conversation so far, but I see 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with Jane Jacobs quotes put on phone poles around. She's very much, her spirit still animates parts of this city?
Very much so. And, it may be a little bit in the background because, she was really influential through the 60s and the 70s on the city's political culture. And when I talk about the city, I mean the old central city of Toronto, which had its own government and its own more progressive way of doing things. But her influence, really in important ways shaped what Toronto is today. She came here in 1968 at a time when Toronto, like a lot of cities in North America, was, struggling with the idea of urban renewal. Toronto didn't really have the same kind of economic downturn in its central city as a lot of American cities did.
It didn't seem to get hollowed out in that way.
It didn't. At least not to the same degree. The economic picture was a little different. A lot of things were a little different here than they were in American cities, but there were large-scale infrastructure projects. There were new highways that ran through the middle of downtown, and the central city did lose a lot of people as people moved to the suburbs, some of which are now part of the city. But, the city lost some of its density, some of its energy, and there was a strong push from certain people to follow the American model. Of urban renewal. We tore down a lot of buildings. There was a point when downtown Toronto, had a shocking number of parking lots.
Yes.
Like a lot of places, but they were filled in, and a lot of that has to do with Jane Jacobs. She, among architects and among planners and among figures in city government, she really helped shape a new idea of the city that involved keeping what was here, preserving the historic fabric of the city, first of all, but also adding new construction and new housing in ways that were sort of compatible with the old. So low-rise buildings, buildings that were tucked into and behind existing ones. And those ideas through architects and through architectural academics, really shaped a lot of what happened in Toronto through that crucial period of the 60s and 70s, so that the central city didn't get obliterated by large-scale redevelopment. And we still context today. If you talk about architects in Toronto, you hear about context. That's one of the watchwords. And that means a few different things, but more than anything else, it means being respectful to the urban fabric, and often, at least, rhetorically, to the city's heritage fabric. And those, we're not, our culture doesn't really create aggressive, look at me, showy buildings. That's not what we do here. And I like to, this a favorite quote of mine is from the our architectural academic George Baird, an architect who's an important figure in the sort of intellectual history of architecture here. He says that Toronto has more great second-rate buildings than any city in the world.
More great second-rate buildings. I mean, and there's a lot of, the buildings that stand out to me in Toronto seem not to be large-scale. They're small buildings. You know, Honest Ed's is bigger than you'd expect, and it's not really, I don't know if it's distinguished in how it's built, but it's distinguished in how it's presented, you know. It's distinctive. And tell me, here's an example of a building that is low profile, but still I find myself thinking about it. What's the deal with the Castle Frank subway station?
That's an interesting question. You know, Toronto's transit infrastructure is a fraught subject for anybody who lives here. You know, the city built, you know, pretty boldly a new subway system through the 50s and 60s when it was much smaller and much less dense than it is now. And since then, you know, to make a very long story short, we haven't done much of anything. But those subway stations that were built in that case sort of in the mid or late 1960s, you know, had this sort of robust, you know, fairly modest modern aesthetic to them. And people don't necessarily see the beauty in the details of those buildings, although I like them very much. Yeah. You know, that's part of the sort of the modern fabric of the city, which there's a lot of, and which, you know, is in front of us all the time here, but which kind of goes unremarked on. It's interesting.
That was one of the buildings I was specifically told to walk by one of the people I was interviewing before. Like, you got to see this Castle Frank subway station. It's so odd. Well, they described it as being empty. It seems like it's purposeless when you go in there. Yeah. But there was like 2 people in there. I've seen emptier subway stations. I mean, in Los Angeles, they have these cavernous subway stations where I've been the only person in there sometimes. There's not even an attendant. And I mean, have you been much to Los Angeles?
No, I haven't. It's been on the top of my list of places to go for years, actually. But no, I'd very much like to go, but I have not.
This is another parallel with transit. Like, people have the same complaints about transit in Los Angeles and Toronto, but for different reasons. Toronto stopped too early, and Los Angeles started too late with building. And so there's different oddities. Like, as I say, Los Angeles has these giant subway stations that are all built differently, and as a result, very difficult to clean. So Metro has found out, but they're working out the kinks in that. And I wonder, you know, speaking of big oddities in Los Angeles, you know, Frank Gehry is a hard name to avoid when you're talking about Los Angeles architecture, not just for the Disney Concert Hall, but for much of what he's built toward the coast where he lives. Even his own house is a striking example. But he is from Toronto. You know, how do you consider him more a Torontonian architect or an Angeleno architect?
Well, I think there are people here who would like to claim him as Canadian, you know, as we often do with Canadians who have moved to the United States and found success there, of which there are a lot. I mean, as you may or may not know, certainly in the entertainment industry, there are a lot of, you know, fairly famous people who you might not know are from here. But Gehry is, I mean, I don't think there's any question that he's a product of California, of Southern California. You know, I mean, to try and, you know, deny that would be silly. But he has emotional ties here, and over the last 10 or 15 years, a few people have tried to bring him back to work here. And out of that, we have gotten already one very successful project, which was the renovation, the remodeling of the Art Gallery of Ontario, the major art museum here, which is a complicated project, you know, kind of in many ways well suited to him. It's sort of a palimpsest of, you know, one renovation or one remodel on top of another, and it's great. And it also stands very close to where his childhood home, where the home of his grandparents was, just down the street. And that house where his grandparents lived has been torn down for a new condo building.
Sure. So these things happen, but I mean, I wonder, would the way a Frank Gehry builds, would it be more difficult to, even in the Los Angeles of today, or any, you know, let's say America versus Toronto now, would it be difficult to have a sort of signature Frank Gehry building built here?
Well, we actually are getting one. And this is going to take us back to more or less where we began with Honest Ed's, because the family of Honest Ed Mirvish, principally his son, David Mirvish, became an art dealer and a collector, and he is now he now owns a chunk of real estate downtown, including a theater and a few 19th century loft buildings. And that very large site, he's hired Gehry to design a new project for, which after a lot of very loud back and forth, and a lot of conversations about whether Toronto was really ready to grow up and handle a big project, such as Frank Gehry can bring us. It's going to happen, or it's planned to, at a very large scale. So he's going to be designing two buildings, two condo towers of 80 plus stories, together with a shopping mall and some cultural facilities and a private gallery for the owner of this property, David Mirvish. And it's going to be very bold, very, very bold indeed. And
now I think about that, and I think about the difficulties that the coffee shop we're sitting in front of had opening up. I mean, we're here in a very residential neighborhood, but we're at a coffee shop that is one of the favorites it's one of my favorites so far, and I've seen about a dozen Toronto coffee shops. This place is representative of its struggles to open here amid houses. That's representative of what in Toronto?
More than anything else, the central place of the neighborhood in city culture and in city planning. Part of what we were talking about earlier, the strong culture in the 1960s and 1970s of keeping this fabric of the city intact and resisting sort of the large-scale, modernist urban renewal. That was partly because there were stable neighborhoods and stable communities in the central city, but it also created a real hostility towards redevelopment of all kinds, and a real sense that the neighborhoods, which have a capital N in the city plan, really need to be protected. So once you get away from the major streets of Toronto and get into the neighborhoods, it's hard to do, or relatively hard to do, much of anything. It also means that on the large scale, the planning mechanisms here are complicated and involve lawyers.
Yes.
Always, and a lot of what is effectively litigation. So developers will hire tons of consultants and find their way to navigate through a complicated process involving the city and then this board that is appointed by the province to oversee development, the Ontario Municipal Board, and so there's this dance that developers and the architects who work for them have to do in sort of appealing to local, very, very local concerns while trying to build large projects. And I think in many ways that's very healthy. It helps to bring specific cash contributions toward community services, schools, community centers, cultural facilities. But, in many ways it also makes the intensification of the city and the redevelopment of parts of the city, which are absolutely healthy and absolutely necessary, the planning culture here makes that harder than it ought to be in many cases.
Why would a Torontonian not want a coffee shop near their house?
I think a Torontonian would today. I think if you go back 5 or 10 years and you go into a neighborhood like this one that has been fairly stable for generations, you find people who are worried about a restaurant or a coffee shop moving in next to them that's going to be noisy or going to be disruptive. And the new kind of the new city that we are living in here, where we have this, very well-designed cafe that serves excellent coffee, and where, freelance graphic designers are on their laptops, that didn't really exist, and that didn't exist in, the eyes and the imaginations of a lot of people who lived here 10 years ago. So, seeing this new sort of fine-grained, centrally focused, mixed-use, new economy Toronto, it's been a bit of an adjustment for many people to make. And I think we are, generally, it is happening now.
Did your own interest in architecture, design, or Toronto come first?
They really came at the same time for me. I grew up in this region, and especially in the city, I think the formative experience for me was going to college here, going to university at the University of Toronto, where I did my undergrad. And
that's an interesting mix of architecture on that campus.
It is, and a lot of it, through the mid 1990s, when I was a student, there was a lot of it that was going up there. New projects by by excellent local offices like co-engineer architects and a number of international stars, including Morphosis. There's a big, prominent building there.
Yes. Which was discussed, is this overhang that says Toronto on it really suitable for Toronto?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it is. I mean, it's a very un-Toronto kind of building. But, there was this wave of redevelopment and of really high-quality contemporary buildings and spaces happening there, as well as elsewhere in the city, but particularly at the university. And that, I think more than anything else, that's what got me to focus my sort of long-standing interest on cities and on development on architecture as such. And it helped tap me into what is, in fact, a very sophisticated culture of architecture here. But that culture doesn't always show up very easily because Toronto architects work, especially the good ones, tend to work on a small scale. Yes. They work on private houses, as in Los Angeles. They work on small buildings, small cultural institutions, and the really great, really innovative work. You have to kind of know what to look for and kind of know where to look for it. And when I started looking for it, I started discovering one after another in a string of, really interesting, sophisticated, beautiful buildings that had been invisible to me.
When someone comes to Toronto for the first time and they want an architecturally interesting view of Toronto, what do they tell them to keep in mind? Like, not necessarily go to this place, but how should they approach the city?
It's complicated. One thing about Toronto is that as a visitor, it's a difficult city to navigate, I think, because what people talk about as neighborhoods are actually strips in many cases. They're linear.
Another thing in common with Los Angeles. Yeah.
That's true. It absolutely is. So if you're walking, you don't necessarily see, or you're on a bike even, you don't necessarily see sort of clusters of buildings and of, institutions or stores or restaurants that hang together to make a neighborhood in a clear way. You have to sort of wander a bit to go looking for them and to go looking for very particular buildings. I think we were talking earlier about context and sort of the importance of context. The most beautiful buildings in Toronto and the most sophisticated buildings are often ones that don't jump out at you. So I make a few recommendations. But some of them are buildings that you can't even see. One of the most talked about buildings and the most published buildings in Toronto of the last few years was a private house called the Integral House. It was designed by these local architects, Shim Sutcliffe, Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, both of whom have long roots in Toronto, and have built a little bit internationally, but are, very, by their own choice, are very focused on building here. And they're devoted to this idea of craft, and of very high quality buildings that are, very much rooted in Toronto and in a few sort of, influences, Scandinavian influences, as well as, those of what you could call the Toronto school of the 60s and 70s. And this house, the Integral House, is not really a house. It's really a private house attached to a concert hall that was built by a mathematician who became wealthy by writing the best-selling calculus textbook. Wow. And it's this incredible, I think it's a 5-level building that's tucked down into a ravine, as many great houses in Toronto are. The city is crossed by these deep wooded ravines that are, beautiful places to go into. But this house is effectively hidden. And unless you get an invitation, the only way to spot this place is to go down into the park at the bottom of the ravine, when the leaves are down and to look up for it. And the quality of the architecture is tremendous, but it is hidden, as many of the great things in Toronto are.
What changed about your idea of what Toronto was when you started discovering really where the interesting buildings were, really how people were building here? I mean, did your whole conception of the city change, or was it just kind of a new angle on it for you?
In some ways, it really did shake things up, because certain things that I'd seen as kind of inevitable, I began to realize weren't. For one thing, high-rises. In fact, both sets of my grandparents lived at different times in high-rise towers or mid-rise apartment buildings in the suburbs. And so as a child, I spent, the places that I was most at home were, on the 10th or on the 16th floor of these buildings, surrounded by sort of private parkland and then, green space. And that model, which seems so natural to me, I came to realize was very, very unusual. Toronto, which has, as I now know, more high-rise buildings than any other city in North America except for Toronto and Chicago. And it has many of those buildings in the suburbs. They helped to bring density as the city was growing to new neighborhoods and to sort of to keep the population varied. Today, those buildings have problems, many of them, because they're run down and they've become landing points certainly for new immigrants to Toronto. And because they're products of a car-centered culture, require a lot of new infrastructure and also just repairs and remediation to really function well. But again, Toronto was always a city of houses and of apartments for me, and that was one thing that I came to realize was interesting. Another was the idea of the infill building or of context, which there are a few buildings that I'm aware of. There are a couple of foundational early buildings by the architectural practice of Diamond and Myers in the 1960s, one of which is a building that you would never notice as a tourist, I don't think. It's called the Hydro Block. It's a 6 or 7, no, I lie. I believe a 4-story building in red brick, definitely with a strong Louis Kahn influence, that has social housing in it. And that building is relatively quiet. It holds its place on the streetscape. It fits in fairly comfortably to a neighborhood of houses next to it. But it becomes more interesting if you realize that Diamond and Myers proposed this building as a replacement for what would have been a complex of high-rises filling in the whole block. And they found a way of, or rather, I misspoke. They proposed it as an alternative to a set of high-rises that would have brought in, a certain number of apartments, but would have been very tall and would have, in the view of the time, would have overwhelmed the neighborhood. And they found a new way of sort of packing that volume of housing, that volume of people into a much sort of more quiet and neighborly urban form, and keeping in place a lot of the historic buildings that stood on the block. It's a question of urban design and of urbanism that's pretty abstract, but the result is, a happy, pleasant, interesting piece of the city that wouldn't have been there or wouldn't have looked this way if it wasn't for those ideas. And when you know about that history, and when you understand the significance of the emphasis on context and on modest info, you see it everywhere. Diamond and Myers worked together very productively for a few years and then went their separate ways. But the architectural practice of Barton Myers, who produced one of what became today, I would argue, Toronto's dominant architecture firm. Myers moved to Los Angeles, where he still works today. And when he left in the late 1980s, the 4 young partners in his firm, Kuwabara, Payne, McKenna, and Bloomberg, took over the office, took over some projects, and very much kept on with his spirit and with his influence guiding them. And today, a lot of the most beautiful new buildings in Toronto are products of their practice, or of another practice called Diamond Schmidt, which came out of Jack Diamond's office. And today, those offices don't do showy buildings, but they do beautiful ones. And in many cases, they've done projects and buildings that have really renewed the city without disrupting or being overly loud or pushy, in relation to what was there before. It's a quiet, well-detailed, very urbane sort of modernism that animates the architectural culture of the city today.
This idea of avoiding what might overwhelm the neighborhood is interesting to me because it fits in with, it seems like it's across Canada, this idea that either the culture or the sort of way things are in Canada is, Canadians seem to approach it with the sense that it's fragile. Like, in a broad sense, if we don't have enough Canadian literature being put out, we'll just get overwhelmed by America or whatever. But it seems to me that maybe Canadians think things are more fragile than they are here. Maybe their culture is more robust than they think. Maybe the neighborhoods can withstand coffee shops or indeed high-rises more than Canadians think. I mean, do you get that sense that things are thought to be more fragile than they are here?
I do think so, and I'm more or less a native of this area, so I've had to sort of struggle with these ideas myself, and very often, this was particularly true until a couple of years ago, but I'd get into conversations with people where they would start talking about how great things are in some other city, or how great things are in other bigger cities that have got it figured out, and I would ask them, which city is that? And they don't always have a good answer.
Other ones,
Other ones, exactly. Except for New York. Right. Toronto has this, complicated sort of inferiority complex about New York, because New York is close. It's an hour by air. And there are a lot of Canadians who live there. And a lot of, I think I read there are 100,000 Canadians who live in New York City. And I'm guessing a lot of them are from here. And, I myself spent a year working and studying in New York. So, which in some ways is a very Torontonian thing to do. But, it also, I don't think New York is the best comparison for a city like Toronto. Toronto is growing very rapidly right now, is extraordinarily diverse, socially, culturally, and economically is doing pretty well. And in many ways, we are sort of still inventing what the Toronto of the 21st century is going to look like. And it's not going to look like New York. It can't look like New York. And I think, because people are inclined to make that comparison, we're going to lose every time, very few cities are, can equal New York in size, complexity, and sheer kind of interestingness. I think that as Canadians, we're inclined to, it's hard not to compare ourselves with the United States in many ways. And a lot of Canadians have a complicated relationship of, being very closely engaged with American culture, or at least on some level, and then feeling resentful of the sort of the behemoth that is America, that is next door. So, all of that animates, who we are as a city as well. That it's hard not to compare yourself to the bigger, richer, more interesting person who lives next door to you. So, but we're doing okay with that, I think.
What did you learn by having a year of constant contact with New York City?
It was that, and then I think more than one of the things that surprised me most, and I had some contacts and some friends in New York when I got there, but one thing I didn't really understand was how friendly the place was. People have this idea of New York as being incredibly intimidating and New Yorkers as being rude, and
you get beaten up for swiping your Metro card wrong or whatever.
Exactly, but it is it's the place in America, and it's the place in North America where public space is the most robust. Where the public conversation is most robust, where people talk to their neighbors and they know who their neighbors are, and they spend time out in the city with other people. And I was teaching in the City University of New York system, with students who in many cases came out of New York public schools, and they were people who were incredible, and everybody I met was incredibly warm, engaged, sure, ambitious, not retiring, not modest, but everybody was happy to be in the city and to live as people in a city. There was this idea of engaging with the larger community, and not just with the sort of selected community in which you've sort of embedded yourself. Everybody mixes, people talk, and and everybody gains from that. And I think I'd like to see, and I like to think I brought a little bit of that attitude back with me, and I think in many cases, this place, Toronto, is unduly modest, not just about our, we as our place, we're not just too modest about our place in the world, but individually, self-promotion doesn't come naturally to people here. Reaching out to strangers, or it doesn't in any sphere, doesn't come naturally. It's not so much part of our culture. And the fact is that this is a very big and complicated and rich city that has a lot of pockets of people with different experiences who, really would benefit from talking to each other. And I really hope that, as New Yorkers in many cases do, I really hope that we can learn to talk to each other across the city, and to not be afraid to, in every sense, strike up a conversation.
As I say, I find so many Los Angeles parallels, but of course, Toronto has been long called the New York of Canada, maybe because it's just the place with the most people. But I wonder, it seems like it did have a really strong parallel with New York for a long time as being such the city that everyone else in the country hated. I guess it's true of Los Angeles as well. You're supposed to dislike it, and pre 9/11 anyway, you were supposed to hate New York. Right. Do you think it was a similar kind of resentment that New York inspired in Americans, that Toronto inspired in Canadians, or continues to, maybe? I don't know.
I think it does, and I think that has to do with the sort of the idea of Canada as a rural nation. It's sort of this anti-urban idea.
Toronto, Canada.
Exactly. It's the city.
Yes.
And to a really unhealthy degree, people, still across Canada still think of Toronto as hostile and as unwelcoming. and I don't think, as I discovered, being in New York, I think that's also true here. We are polite people. We're nice people. Outsiders, there are serious institutional problems with how immigrants to Canada are being integrated here and are being able to find their way. But, on the whole, we do a pretty good job of welcoming people. And, that in fact is one of the strengths of this city, that so many people from all over the place are here now and are making their contributions, or are starting to be able to make their contributions. And I think that is going to become much clearer over the next generation.
Is this inevitable with big cities? I think of also, say, in North America as well, Mexico City. Mexicans insist that that's different. That's not Mexico. And I like going to Mexico City. I never go anywhere else in Mexico, so that may be why they say it to me, but they'll insist that's Mexico City. That's different. Or I was in England recently, and people insist even in London. London is not England. London is its own republic put down in the middle of England. Does it happen to every city?
I think it does. I think that's true. And the more powerful, the more dominant the city is within the country and within the region, you know, the more powerful that resentment has to be. And I think it's just incredibly, you know, counterproductive. You know, the politics of, you know, Ontario, the province that we're in, and of Canada are not friendly to cities, or have not been friendly to cities, especially right now. You know, Canada has a conservative government that is, you know, has generally hostile attitudes towards a lot of the things that cities need, you know, at a time when, you know, this city and others in Canada have very serious needs in terms of infrastructure, and where, you know, there would be a real payoff, you know, in terms of the quality of life, in terms, and economically as well, if the city got what it needed, if it got the transit that it needed, if it got the social services that it really needs. And that sort of anti-urban resentment is in many ways, you know, holding back our country as well as other countries. You know, I mean, I think we all have to adapt to the fact that we are, you know, the world is urbanizing rapidly, and, you know, here, you know, our country is urbanizing rapidly, and the city is becoming, you know, even more important than it's ever been, and, you know, and should be treated well. But I wonder if the culture will change. You know, these things are hard to shift.
It's something else that may be generational, but it does seem, from what I understand, Toronto has become more conscious of itself recently, as Los Angeles has. But I mean, with that comes, well, a good illustration in Los Angeles is the groups emerge who want to preserve whatever Los Angeles was, that they think was the defining era. You know, maybe they like googie coffee shops and fight to preserve those. Here, I mean, you know, for example, that Sam the Record Man sign. What was the story with that thing?
That's another sort of piece of, you know, mid-20th century kitsch, essentially. But, you know, it was a landmark. It was there was a music store, Sam the Record Man, another sort of old school retailer who didn't really modernize, you know, and when I say modernize, I have that in quotes, but, you know, it remained, you know, independent and, you know, an interesting place. So when the store finally closed, this big kind of kitschy neon sign that had been there for many, many years, you know, people were attached to it. And, in the end, it is being saved, in a sort of reduced state. But, you know, I mean, that was part of the Yonge Street strip, Yonge Street being the main artery down the middle of downtown Toronto, and which at one point was, you know, the heart of a really vibrant rock and folk music scene, and today is a little bit tired, not the most vibrant part of the city, and what's going in on the site where that store, Sam the Record Man, used to be, is a new university building for the University Ryerson, which is located downtown, which is expanding and, you know, becoming more ambitious. And they're building a new student center by Snowhetta on that site, which is going to be very interesting. I think it's going to be a really beautiful building that does, you know, architecturally and urbanistically does some really interesting things to help bring back and enliven that chunk of the city. So it's a good news story, but again, you know, that piece of the 1960s that, you know, is so hard to let go of for many people has got to go. It's on the way.
It doesn't mean anything anymore. Yeah, it's like, I wonder, there's this sense though of like, if we tear something down from a while ago that was quirky, there's no chance we'll ever build something as interesting, or certainly not more interesting. Like, what's that sense of like, we're somehow out of the ability to build interesting things, so we've just got to keep whatever was kind of interesting before. You know what I mean?
I do. I really know what you mean. And
why do we believe that about ourselves?
That's an interesting question in Los Angeles, which has, you know, definitely a different history. But in Toronto, I think it's generational. And as you were saying, Los Angeles, in both cities, I think the shift is generational, and it has to do with the city changing, growing very quickly, changing very quickly, and at a pace that is too fast for many people to catch on to. You know, if you're in your 50s or 60s here, you know, the city, and you were, you know, grew up in and around Toronto, the city of your youth doesn't really exist anymore. You know, and if you're still attached to that city, which is among other things a city where you can drive anywhere, you know, easily and quickly.
20 minutes to everywhere was a Los Angeles saying.
I thought it was half an hour. Is that the update?
They bumped it up, but I mean, now who knows? I don't even drive there, but it's not 20. If it ever was 20 minutes to everywhere, it's not anymore.
Yeah, it's forever on the 405. Yeah.
Well, that one, oh my God.
Well, it's forever on the 401 here, or the 404. You know, those it's, you know, certain.
I did hear the 401 surpassed every freeway in Los Angeles, and I guess North America to become the most congested.
It's incredible. I mean, that's sort of a national, or it's sort of a more or less a national road that goes through the city. But, the point is Toronto did and still does have a strong car culture. Transit never got eradicated here. People have always taken transit, and today they still do. And today more people would like to, but the transit system is, for various convoluted political reasons, not where it should be. We're still building transit, but not at the pace that we should be, and we haven't caught up to where we need to be. But, that's one of the changes that are hard to assimilate if you've lived here for 50 or 60 years, that, it was a smaller, more parochial, less international, and much more drivable place to be, a more suburban place. And, the city that's emerging it looks different from that. And if your daily experience doesn't teach you that, then you just don't understand why it takes so long to drive everywhere now.
I know. I agree that it was probably fun to drive to Sam the Record Man in its heyday and park in front of it. But why is that the high watermark, and we'll never get better than that in the mind of someone who, is it just they like who they were in those days more? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think people, you're always attached to what you knew and what you loved when you were young. But it's interesting, we've talked about these two retail landmarks, neither one of which in my mind really deserves to be called a landmark. Yeah. Certainly in architectural terms, those places are nothing, yes. They really are, they're junk. But they're also located, in the central city, right next to subway stations. People used to drive in from the suburbs to go to the record store, right. Or as teenagers used to take the subway to go to the record store. But that, that vibrancy has to do with street life. It has to do with being in a crowded neighborhood where there are people around, and those are the places that were magical. What is a magical place that you drive to? In Toronto, they don't exist. We don't quite have the natural landscape that you guys do. We don't have the ocean. We do have the lake, which is beautiful, but, it's not, basically, the interesting urban places are not places you get to by car, and where Toronto is growing and where, real estate prices are high and where there is attention and where there's focus are the places that have always been dense and that have always been accessible by transit and that you can ride your bike to now,
Yes, of course. There's that element as well, the sort of bikeability, and that, I find that to be a good way to get a sense of it, the built environment on a bike. Do you do that as well?
I do. I do drive a car.
So you see it at every pace, essentially. Is there any form of transportation you don't use?
I don't take public transit almost at all. My wife, who doesn't drive, takes transit every day, but I either drive or bike just because, when I'm going to work, it's not a long trip, but, transit is it's fairly convenient, but it's so slow that it's not worth it. I can take...
You can beat the streetcar on a bike.
I can take, I can walk to a streetcar and take the streetcar and be at work in, half an hour to 40 minutes, or I can bike and be there in 15, or I can drive my car and be there in 12, which is in the wintertime what I do. Although I'm a little reluctant to admit that. It's not exactly virtuous. But
it gets cold, I understand.
It does get cold, and people bike through the winter, and I don't have the courage to do that. I admire people who do, but no, there's a strong culture of cycling, which, there are people riding by us here on the street, that's really grown. I was riding my bike 10 or 12 years ago in downtown, and there were very few people doing that. And today it's become much more of a mainstream choice. The problem is that, the infrastructure isn't there. Our current mayor, who you may have heard of, actually oversaw the removal of a bike lane through the middle of that gave people a route into downtown, at a cost of $100,000, I think it was, So, we're really struggling politically with, the tension between people who feel that, roads are for cars and that you should be able to drive everywhere easily, and the more complex sort of multimodal reality that we need to move towards and that we are going to move towards because there's no more room on the roads for cars.
Now, why, this is, I suppose, a point in the favor of people who want to preserve the quirky old stuff. Why are there, to go back to the dull condo buildings, why did they get built so dully? It seems like if so many people want to move downtown and you're competing, you want to build a non-dull building, but I guess not.
Well, that's the thing. You don't need to compete.
I see.
As a developer, and I think in a way that's a real sign of health that, people are, either themselves or, landlords, who intend to rent to young professionals, or young professionals. One way or the other, people are willing to buy real estate, downtown, and they want to do it so badly that, they'll buy anything, and people have been worried about a real estate bubble here. People keep wondering when the bubble is going to pop, but, the prices have been going up almost continuously since 1998, and there is a fundamental shift that's happening that, not everyone, but many people are choosing to live in a more urban way. And, if you don't have a lot of money and you want to own your home, that means buying an apartment, and it doesn't really matter what it looks like. I think the quality has been improving dramatically. There are new buildings now that are more ambitious, but the problem is just that junk sells.
Yes.
And I really hope
so. A slowdown would be okay.
I think in many ways a slowdown would be nice. When we saw a bit of a slowdown in 2009 and, a number of buildings under construction or, in development kind of fell apart. But I think what's going to be more interesting is that as developers become more sophisticated, they really turn to architects and good architects to find interesting solutions. We've talked about the Honest Ed site. The developers of that site are from Vancouver, and they know how to do interesting, nuanced urban form. And they're hiring, they're called West Bank, and they're hiring Vancouver architects called Henriquez Partners to do this project. And, in many ways, I hope it's going to look a little bit like a certain building in Vancouver called the Woodwards. Which wound up redeveloping a big site in a very troubled neighborhood, the downtown east side, and combines retail and community space and arts facilities and, housing for the very poor with luxury condos all in one. Vancouver, because of its culture and its, its regulatory and planning culture, has done that sort of city building very well. We don't do it as well, but we're trying, and I think that partly for economic reasons, we're going to see more of that. We're going to see new development that actually makes the city more interesting rather than kind of deadens it with sort of poor quality retail and a bunch of one-bedroom apartments. So,
yes. You mentioned Vancouver. It's a city I go to often and enjoy. But there's here, there's there. What other Canadian cities fascinate you? Are there other ones? Does Vancouver genuinely fascinate you, like Toronto does? Do other Canadian cities do it?
Well, there's Montreal. Vancouver is. I like Vancouver a lot, but there's a kind of there's a rivalry between Vancouver and Toronto in the eyes of many people, and I think that Toronto is a much uglier city in every sense, and in some ways a much worse governed city. But, I don't think, in my own mind, I don't think there's any question of where I want to live. This is just a much bigger, and not necessarily in all ways, but in some ways a more global city, and I think a more interesting one. But Montreal is, an interesting case because, it was Canada's metropolis and Canada's business center, and has a really interesting, cultural mix and a really tremendously interesting built fabric and architectural culture, but it's all kind of contained. Quebec is sort of in many ways is an island within Canada, and Montreal is an island, sort of a multilingual, multi-ethnic island within Quebec, and so there isn't as much crossover from there to here as you would like. But they know how to do city living in Montreal.
So maybe we could say if Toronto is New York, Montreal is Boston. If Toronto is Los Angeles, Montreal is San Francisco. Like, it's a city that people like to visit and like the lifestyle of, but don't really take seriously.
Well, it's complicated because, again, in Quebec, which is in many ways isolated from the rest of Canada, a very sort of proudly sort of nationalistic society, proudly francophone, has Montreal in the middle of it, and Montreal is this island partially literally an island, where people speak English as well as French, and that is much more open to outsiders than the rest of Quebec. And so it's got these very particular history and this very particular sort of mix of cultures that leaves it isolated. And if you go there, it really feels. Certainly, if you go there from the U.S., it feels like a foreign country, in the way that coming to Toronto doesn't necessarily. And even from here, it feels remarkably different, and in many ways positively so. It's a beautiful, interesting, dense, lively place. But people aren't coming there the way that they're coming here, and economically, Montreal is not doing as well as Toronto is, and probably in the near future isn't going to be. So. Economically, not politically, but culturally as well, Toronto is on the rise in a way that Montreal isn't. So it's got. I love going there. I love the place, and that's there's a vivid rivalry there, and I don't want to speak to that at all because I really really like Montreal, and I think we should learn from it. But,
you referenced this idea that I'm sure people in Montreal haven't. It seems elsewhere across Canada and in Toronto. I mean, I've been hearing it said over and over, just as axiomatic, that Toronto is ugly, but no view of Toronto I've had as ugly. No one view I would say, oh, that's an ugly view of Toronto. I mean, why has the idea that Toronto is ugly taken such root?
That's a really interesting question. It's interesting to hear you say that there isn't anywhere that's ugly. I mean, we don't have. There was never a period where Toronto was planned in a large-scale, systematic way. We have, bits and pieces of Beaux-Arts, we have bits and pieces of modernist city planning, and we have some, monumental buildings, but there isn't a great street or a great district that really, hangs together where everything, seems to fit together and work together beautifully. We have bits and pieces, but there isn't any there isn't any single vista or any spot that is really beautiful. And the city was built, in a varied way over a long period of time. And there's a mix of influences, a mix of building types, a mix of architectural influences, materials. It's a bit of a mess. It's a bit scattershot. And I think that, if you come from here and you go to, either somewhere that has the grandeur that, Manhattan does or Brownstone, Brooklyn does, or you go to a city like, or even you mentioned San Francisco. I mean, any of the big, beautiful American cities, in their own ways, Boston or San Francisco or Chicago, they all have buildings and they have districts that are pretty. And Toronto doesn't. Now, Toronto was, it was an industrial city and it was a backwater until, I would say, 50 to 70 years ago. It really was. And, the way the city looks still kind of reflects that sense, that grand plans didn't really happen here. It was a city where things got done. And I suppose the question is how we update that city and we make it more beautiful in the contemporary sense and more interesting in the contemporary sense. And I think it's happening, but it isn't necessarily happening in ways that you can see. The most interesting buildings, the most interesting projects, the most powerful ideas are subtle, and you have to know where to look in order to find them.
It's, again, the same could be said about Los Angeles, and people, I think it's less, they don't actually find it ugly, but I feel like they think they're supposed to find it ugly. Like it's a city you're supposed to find ugly, right. Toronto or Los Angeles. But, you mentioned the cities that are pretty, and I can't help but notice those are not really the currently vital cities. Like prettiness and vitality, those are two different things, right?
It's true. They are. And, part of it has to do with where cities were, the 50 years ago and 80 years ago. Toronto's at its greatest point of relevance right now. Economically, that's a bit of a question mark, but in terms of the size of the city and in terms of its cultural sophistication, there's no question this is a more interesting place and a more successful place than it's ever been. This is our moment here. And the cities that had their moments, in the 1920s or even, in the 1880s and 1890s, have beautiful things in a way that we don't. Buffalo, New York is right across the lake, and there are some very nice buildings in Buffalo. But as you say, Buffalo is not vibrant. It's coming back, but I don't think
it's having a bit of a renaissance.
It is, and it's actually there's a surprising number of interesting things going on there. But I'm not moving there.
Right, it's funny. Like in Los Angeles and in Toronto, people could complain all the time about how it looks, how things are, the transit, but they are here. They're not going anywhere, are they?
They're not, and it's a really interesting question. The city, it's almost hard for me as a native to believe, but I mean, the number of people who are coming into the city and into the region, is shocking. I mean, I think the number is 100,000 a year. From other parts of Canada or from other countries into the region. Now, many of those people are moving into the suburbs, into a Toronto that you're not really going to see as a visitor. But there's a economic vitality here, and there are cultural institutions, and there are public institutions, our education system that make it a place that you can actually live and where you want to live. And that is. It doesn't always look pretty, but, and we certainly have had problems, and we do have problems. But in many ways, it's a city that works very well. And it's not always easy to appreciate, if you're here, just how well many things are still going today.
It's something summarized best, I think, by a guy named Jordan Mechner. He's known for being the designer of the video game Prince of Persia. That's his claim to fame, but he's lived in a bunch of world cities and done various projects, and he said something semi-recently, like he lives in Los Angeles now, but he's lived all around, and he said, I now realize great cities are ones people complain about. If you're in a city no one ever complains about, they're always sort of trumpeting its good qualities, you're dealing with a mediocre city. A great city is one where people freely complain because, it can handle it. And there's it's a sense of, what kind of spirit is that an indicator of?
I think you've got it exactly right. I mean, there is boosterism here, and for a long time, people like to talk about Toronto as being a world-class city, or of, right, or of doing what we needed to do to become a world-class city.
Los Angeles said that for a long time, too.
Yeah. And I think that sort of boosterism is not quite what it used to be. Partly because the city is in many ways, socially, economically, and in terms of its built form too, is hanging together pretty well. It's just difficult for what we're working on here as a project, is sort of a civic project that is subtle and is not particularly showy, and that has to do with the culture and who we as a culture are, if I can say that there is, a we in Toronto, which is an increasingly difficult thing. I mean, we're trying to figure out, the city is trying to figure out in a lot of senses, who we are. Are we the Victorian city, that needs to be protected and restored? And, are we, the global powerhouse, and if so, how do we make all of the suburban cityscape work better for the people who are there? And there are a lot of sort of nested problems, nested challenges about integration, about mobility, about infrastructure that need to be worked on. But in spite of what are a series of struggles, it's hanging together. We're hanging together really quite well, if we can let ourselves admit it. And I think it's one sign of that is that indeed we complain about the place. Yes. we don't have to argue for the greatness of Toronto anymore. We can yell about what's going wrong.
Indeed, I've been speaking here in Toronto, the city hanging together and having its moment, specifically the Christie Pits neighborhood we've been sitting in, where I've been speaking with Alex Bozikovic. He is the architecture columnist for the Globe and Mail. He writes about architecture and design for a wide variety of venues: Dwell, Architectural Digest, Toronto Live Spacing, and more. Alex, thanks so much.
It's been my pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, John Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.